From the outside, the grand estate where Isabella lived looked like a dream. Towering marble columns, manicured gardens, and gleaming chandeliers gave the illusion of wealth and prosperity. But behind those elegant walls was a truth no one in high society knew. Isabella was not treated as the daughter of the house. She was a servant. Her father, a once successful businessman, had remarried after her mother's death, bringing into their lives a new wife, Madeline, and her equally conniving daughter, Clarissa. At first, things had seemed hopeful. Madeline had promised to care for Isabella as her own. But the moment her father tragically passed away under suspicious circumstances, everything changed. The estate, once filled with warmth and love, became a prison. Madeline took full control, ensuring that Isabella was stripped of every luxury she had once known. Gone were the days of elegant dresses, ballroom lessons, and grand parties. Instead, she was forced into the shadows, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and running errands for the very people who stole her inheritance. Clarissa, a self-absorbed, cruel woman with an insatiable hunger for wealth, delighted in tormenting Isabella. She would flaunt her expensive gowns, mock her for her tattered clothes, and ensure she was humiliated in front of every guest who entered their home. "You're nothing but a maid," Clarissa sneered one evening, tossing a wine glass onto the floor just to watch Isabella scramble to clean it up. "Be grateful we let you stay here at all." And so the world believed the lie. To high society, Isabella was nothing more than a lowly housemaid in the grand estate of Lady Madeline and her beautiful daughter, Clarissa. No one remembered that she was the true heir. But Isabella had a secret, one she had kept hidden for years. She wasn't just the rightful owner of the estate. She was the sole heiress to a hidden fortune, a wealth greater than anything her stepmother and stepsister could ever imagine. Before her father's death, he had confided in her about a secret account, one that held vast riches and assets spread across multiple businesses. He had feared Madeline's greed and had hidden the information away, telling Isabella only she could access it. The problem? She needed to prove her identity before her 21st birthday. If she failed, everything would be lost to the state, and her stepmother would win. As the deadline crept closer, Isabella kept her head down, working like a servant while secretly planning her escape. She had gathered small pieces of evidence: letters, hidden ledgers, a duplicate will, all tucked away in a place only she knew. But time was running out, and Madeline, she was beginning to suspect something. One evening, as Isabella scrubbed the floors, she noticed Madeline watching her with narrowed eyes. "You've been rather quiet lately," she mused, swirling a glass of wine in her hand. "You're not plotting anything foolish, are you?" Isabella met her gaze, forcing a timid smile. "I wouldn't dare, madam." Madeline smirked. "Good, because if you ever try anything, I'll make sure you have nothing left." Clarissa, lounging lazily on a velvet chaise, giggled. Nothing but rags and dishwater anyway. But deep inside, Isabella knew the truth. She had everything, and soon they would find out just how wrong they were. For years, Isabella had been careful. Every insult, every demand, and every injustice from Madeline and Clarissa had been met with quiet obedience. But inside she was always planning, waiting, watching. The key to reclaiming her birthright lay not just in proving her identity, but in outsmarting the women who had stolen everything from her. She moved cautiously. She knew Madeline was suspicious, watching her more closely than ever. Every movement was scrutinized, every whispered conversation noted. Isabella had no room for mistakes. If her stepmother discovered her secret before she was ready, she would lose everything. Late one night, Isabella crept into her father's old study. The room had been locked ever since his passing, a cruel reminder that nothing in the house truly belonged to her anymore. But Isabella had learned long ago where Madeline kept the keys. The scent of aged paper and cedar filled the air as she quietly stepped inside. She moved quickly, knowing she didn't have long. She ran her fingers along the bookshelves, searching for anything her father might have left behind. Then she found it, a leather-bound ledger tucked behind a row of dusty books. She pulled it free, heart pounding as she flipped through the pages. Bank transactions, property records, hidden assets. This was it, the proof she needed. A surge of hope rushed through her. She wasn't powerless. But as she turned the last page, she froze. The final entry had been signed by her father the day before he died. A cold chill ran through her. He had known. He had known he was in danger. She barely had time to process the revelation before she heard the creak of the hallway floorboards. Someone was coming. Isabella barely had enough time to slip the ledger into her skirt pocket before the door swung open. Madeline stood in the doorway. "What are you doing in here?" her stepmother demanded, eyes narrowing as she took a slow step inside. Thinking fast, Isabella lowered her gaze. I was cleaning, madam," she said quickly, gripping the rag she had brought as a disguise. Madeline's cold gaze swept over the room, and for a terrifying moment, Isabella thought she would see the empty space on the bookshelf. Then, Madeline's lips curled into a cruel smirk. Of course, a maid should know her place. She stepped forward, brushing a gloved hand along the desk as if testing for dust. "But if I ever catch you snooping, I will make sure you regret it." Isabella forced herself to remain still, nodding obediently. "Yes, madam." Madeline let out a satisfied hum and turned, exiting the study without another word. Isabella waited until she was gone before releasing the breath she had been holding. She had taken a risk, but she had also taken the first step toward reclaiming what was rightfully hers. And nothing, not even Madeline, was going to stop her. With the ledger hidden safely in her possession, Isabella knew that she had crossed an invisible line, one that could not be undone. Her stepmother suspected something, and suspicion in the hands of Madeline was as dangerous as a sharpened dagger. Isabella had to be smarter, faster, and always one step ahead. The next morning, Isabella moved through the house as if nothing had changed, keeping her head low and her hands busy. But she could feel Madeline's eyes following her. Clarissa, oblivious as ever, continued her usual taunts, but Isabella barely heard them. Her mind was focused on her next move. She needed an ally. That night, she crept through the servants' quarters to find Eleanor, the head housekeeper. Eleanor had worked in the estate long before Madeline arrived, and unlike the other servants who turned their backs on Isabella, Eleanor had always shown quiet kindness. "I need your help," Isabella whispered, pulling the ledger from the folds of her apron. Eleanor's sharp eyes widened as she scanned the pages. "Where did you find this?" "In my father's study," Isabella admitted. "I think he was trying to protect me before he died." Eleanor exhaled slowly, closing the book with a firm hand. "You must be careful, child. If Madeline discovers you have this, she won't stop until she destroys you." "Then help me," Isabella pleaded. "I need to get this proof to someone who can help me reclaim my inheritance." The older woman hesitated for a long moment before finally nodding. "There is one person who might help, Lord Hawthorne." Isabella's breath caught. Lord Hawthorne had been her father's closest friend, a powerful noble with enough influence to challenge Madeline. "But you'll need to be careful," Eleanor warned. "You can't just walk into his estate." Isabella already knew what that meant. She would have to sneak out, undetected. The next evening, under the cover of darkness, Isabella dressed in a plain cloak and slipped out of the estate's back entrance. The town was only a short distance away, but every step felt treacherous. If she was caught, Madeline would never let her see the outside world again. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional carriage passing through. Isabella kept to the shadows, pulling her hood low over her face. Lord Hawthorne's estate loomed in the distance, its iron gates locked for the night. But she knew of a side entrance, a place where she had once played as a child. She was nearly there when she heard it, the sound of footsteps following her. Panic gripped her. She picked up her pace, but the steps matched her rhythm. Someone was watching her. Heart pounding, Isabella slipped into an alleyway and pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath. The footsteps stopped just outside the alley. For a terrifying moment, she thought she had been caught. But after a long pause, the figure moved on. Isabella exhaled shakily. She wasn't safe. Not yet. Gathering her courage, she turned and ran toward Lord Hawthorne's estate. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. The game had begun, and there was no turning back. Isabella reached the grand iron gates of Lord Hawthorne's estate, her breath shallow as she glanced over her shoulder. The shadow that had followed her was nowhere in sight, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She had no time to hesitate. She pressed herself against the stone wall and found the hidden gap in the iron bars, just wide enough for her slender frame. Years ago, her father had taken her here, and she had often used this passage to sneak into the estate gardens undetected. Now, it would serve as her escape route into a different life. The estate was eerily quiet, the windows glowing dimly under the moonlight. Isabella moved quickly, her heart racing as she navigated her way to the back entrance. The heavy oak door loomed before her, and for a brief moment, she hesitated. Would Lord Hawthorne remember her? Would he believe her? Steeling herself, she knocked 3 times. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes. Lord Hawthorne. He studied her for a long moment before realization dawned. Isabella? Relief flooded her, but she knew the battle was far from over. Please, she whispered, gripping the ledger. I need your help. He opened the door wider. Come inside. Inside the warmth of his study, Isabella finally let herself breathe. The room smelled of old books and burning firewood, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had been following her all night. Lord Hawthorne took the ledger from her trembling hands and flipped through it, his expression darkening with each passing page. I knew your father was hiding something, he murmured, but I never imagined it was this extensive. Madeline took everything from me, Isabella said, her voice raw with emotion. She turned me into a servant in my own home. If I don't reclaim my identity before my 21st birthday, everything will be lost. Lord Hawthorne set the book down and met her gaze. And you believe she had a hand in your father's death? Isabella's throat tightened. I know she did. I just don't have the proof. The older man exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. You're not safe, Isabella. If she finds out you've come to me. A knock at the front door interrupted him. Both of them froze. Lord Hawthorne rose slowly. Stay here. Isabella pressed herself into the shadows as he made his way to the entrance. She could hear muffled voices, one of which made her blood run cold. Madeline. Forgive the intrusion, Lord Hawthorne. Madeline's honeyed voice drifted through the hall. I've been searching for my dear stepdaughter. It seems she's gone missing. Isabella's fingers dug into the upholstery of the chair. She had been followed. Lord Hawthorne's voice remained neutral. Isabella? I haven't seen her. Madeline hummed, unimpressed. I do hope you're telling the truth. She's been quite the troublemaker lately, sneaking around and stirring up lies. There was a pause, and Isabella held her breath. Then, Lord Hawthorne responded, his voice cool and unwavering. If I do see her, I'll be sure to return her home safely. Isabella's stomach clenched. He was sending her back. Madeline let out a pleased sigh. I would be ever so grateful. Good night, Lord Hawthorne. The door closed, and Isabella's heart sank. She had risked everything, only to be betrayed. But when Lord Hawthorne returned to the study, his expression was unreadable. He walked past her, went to the fireplace, and threw the ledger into the flames. Isabella shot up from her chair. What are you doing? He turned to her with a knowing look. Burning the copy. Her mouth parted in shock. The copy? Lord Hawthorne smirked. You think I'd risk keeping the real thing where anyone could find it? He walked to his desk and pulled out a locked box. The true ledger is safe, and so are you. A rush of relief flooded Isabella's body, but before she could thank him, he placed a firm hand on her shoulder. You have a choice to make, Isabella. She met his gaze, her determination hardening. You can run, he continued, or you can fight for what's yours. There was no hesitation in her answer. I will fight. Lord Hawthorne smiled. Then let's begin. Isabella sat across from Lord Hawthorne in the dimly lit study, the weight of her decision settling in. She had chosen to fight, but she knew that Madeline was dangerous. If she failed, She wouldn't just lose her inheritance. She could lose her life. Lord Hawthorne studied her for a moment before nodding. If you want to reclaim what's yours, you'll need more than just evidence. You'll need power. What do you mean? Isabella asked. He leaned back in his chair. Madeline has influence in high society. Many nobles owe her favors, and some fear her. But money speaks louder than words, and your father left you more than just a ledger. He left you allies. Isabella leaned forward, intrigued. Who? Lord Hawthorne smirked. His former business partners. When your father was alive, he made investments with powerful merchants, landowners, and even the royal treasury. Many of them don't know he had a daughter, let alone that you're the rightful heir. A spark of hope ignited within Isabella. If they knew the truth, they would support you, Hawthorne finished. But you need to reach them before Madeline does. The next day, Isabella disguised herself as a noblewoman and traveled into the city with Eleanor, who had been instructed to play the role of her lady-in-waiting. It was the first time in years that Isabella had worn a gown that wasn't threadbare and stained. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. She visited one of her father's oldest allies first, Duke Remington. A man known for his sharp mind and sharper tongue. The Duke had been one of her father's closest friends. When Isabella arrived at his estate, she was escorted inside immediately. I never thought I'd see Reginald's daughter again, Duke Remington said, eyeing her carefully. Tell me, child, why should I help you? Isabella took a deep breath. Because my father trusted you, and because if you let Madeline keep control of my estate, she will turn on you next. The Duke raised an eyebrow, impressed by her boldness. He took a sip of his wine before setting the glass down. You have his fire. Very well. You have my support. One by one, Isabella met with her father's former allies. Some were hesitant, but the ledger provided undeniable proof that she was the rightful heir. With every visit, her power grew. She was no longer the helpless servant girl Madeline had tried to break. But Isabella knew she still had one final move to make. She had to confront Madeline on her terms. With Lord Hawthorne and her newfound allies behind her, Isabella sent a formal invitation to her own estate. The invitation was addressed to Lady Madeline and Clarissa. The reason? A ball. It was a dangerous move, but it was also the perfect trap. Madeline would never refuse an invitation from high society, especially when she had spent years securing her place within it. Isabella would use this grand event to reveal the truth. And when the night was over, there would be no doubt. Madeline's reign was coming to an end. Isabella sat across from Lord Hawthorne in the dimly lit study, the weight of her decision settling in. She had chosen to fight, but she knew that Madeline was dangerous. If she failed, she wouldn't just lose her inheritance. She could lose her life. Lord Hawthorne studied her for a moment before nodding. If you want to reclaim what's yours, you'll need more than just evidence. You'll need power. What do you mean? Isabella asked. He leaned back in his chair. Madeline has influence in high society. Many nobles owe her favors, and some fear her. But money speaks louder than words, and your father left you more than just a ledger. He left you allies. Isabella leaned forward, intrigued. Who? Lord Hawthorne smirked. His former business partners. When your father was alive, he made investments with powerful merchants, landowners, and even the royal treasury. Many of them don't know he had a daughter, let alone that you're the rightful heir. A spark of hope ignited within Isabella. If they knew the truth, they would support you, Hawthorne finished. But you need to reach them before Madeline does. The next day, Isabella disguised herself as a noblewoman and traveled into the city with Eleanor, who had been instructed to play the role of her lady-in-waiting. It was the first time in years that Isabella had worn a gown that wasn't threadbare and stained. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. She visited one of her father's oldest allies first, Duke Remington. A man known for his sharp mind and sharper tongue. The Duke had been one of her father's closest friends. When Isabella arrived at his estate, she was escorted inside immediately. I never thought I'd see Reginald's daughter again, Duke Remington said, eyeing her carefully. Tell me, child, Why should I help you? Isabella took a deep breath. Because my father trusted you, and because if you let Madeline keep control of my estate, she will turn on you next. The Duke raised an eyebrow, impressed by her boldness. He took a sip of his wine before setting the glass down. You have his fire. Very well. You have my support. One by one, Isabella met with her father's former allies. Some were hesitant, but the ledger provided undeniable proof that she was the rightful heir. With every visit, her power grew. She was no longer the helpless servant girl Madeline had tried to break. But Isabella knew she still had one final move to make. She had to confront Madeline on her terms. With Lord Hawthorne and her newfound allies behind her, Isabella sent a formal invitation to her own estate. The invitation was addressed to Lady Madeline and Clarissa. The reason? A ball. It was a dangerous move, but it was also the perfect trap. Madeline would never refuse an invitation from high society, especially when she had spent years securing her place within it. Isabella would use this grand event to reveal the truth. And when the night was over, there would be no doubt. Madeline's reign was coming to an end. The grand ballroom still echoed with murmurs and applause long after Madeline and Clarissa had stormed out. Isabella stood at the center of it all, her heart pounding, but her expression composed. For the first time in years, she was no longer a shadow in her own home. Lord Hawthorne placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You've done what many could not. You reclaimed your birthright, and you did it with grace. Isabella exhaled, nodding. It's not just about the estate. It's about freedom. The nobles, once wary of the power Madeline had held over them, now stepped forward, pledging their allegiance to Isabella. Duke Remington raised a glass in a toast. To Lady Isabella Devereux, the rightful heir. The room erupted in agreement. For the first time, Isabella felt seen. The following days were spent undoing the damage that Madeline had left in her wake. Isabella met with her father's former business partners, ensuring that every stolen coin, every misused investment, was restored. The servants, many of whom had been forced into loyalty under Madeline's rule, now looked to Isabella with genuine respect. She walked through the halls of her estate, no longer afraid, no longer a prisoner. Eleanor, ever her steadfast guardian, stood by her side. Your father would be proud, my lady. The words hit Isabella with a wave of emotion. She had won, but more than that, she had honored his legacy. Madeline and Clarissa were gone. With no allies left and their reputations ruined, they had no choice but to leave high society. Rumors spread of their struggles, reduced to living in a modest cottage, a far cry from the lavish wealth they once stole. Isabella had given them a choice: return the stolen fortune or be cast out with nothing. Madeline, too proud to accept defeat, had walked away with only the clothes on her back. It was justice. On a bright morning, Isabella stood at the entrance of her estate, overlooking the gardens where she had once been reduced to servitude. Now she stood as the rightful lady of the house. Lord Hawthorne approached. What will you do now? She smiled. Live, rule wisely, and never let anyone take what's mine again. She turned to Eleanor. There will be changes. This estate will not just be a place of wealth, but a place of fairness. No servant will ever be treated as I was. Eleanor nodded, eyes shining with approval. A noble lady, through and through. As Isabella stepped back into her home, she knew that the past was behind her. The girl they had once called a maid was now the most powerful woman in the city, and she would make sure that no one would ever forget her name again.